So welcome everyone. I'm Jonathan Reams. I'm from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, which sounds very impressive, but it's actually a merger of a technical research university with a humanistic social sciences humanities university about 15 years ago, and so they adopted the big science name. And I'm in the Department of Lifelong Learning and Counseling, and have a nice thing about the Norwegian system is they gave me full tenure to start with. I was like, wow, this is nice. Welcome. I figured, so we're going to start kind of informally because I know what it was like for me, rushing back from lunch yesterday, sneaking late into a session. So we'll just have a little bit of informal conversation while people are drifting in. How many of you who are here were at Bob Keegan's workshop a couple days ago? Okay, so we have some who are in line with that. That's part of what we're going to be talking about today. How many of you are familiar with his developmental work? Yeah? Okay, and for how many of you have no idea what I mean when I say developmental like that? Yeah, no, okay. I mean, it's helpful for me to know how to gauge what level to present at and whatnot, so. Okay, well, let's see. Get my little gizmo here. Welcome. Okay, good turnout. I did this last, so here's full disclosure. I did this same presentation last year in Prague, but we were in this basement of this other hotel way over there, and with another session that didn't really fit. And so I resubmitted it by reframing it, and we've got a year's more of application and research on it. And so this time they accepted it and gave me a whole hour. So I have to thank the Leadership Development MIG for being so gracious in giving me time like this. Come on in. It's okay. We know that people are coming late from lunch. We'll turn this on, see what it says here. Okay. So, what I'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about how we're trying to apply some of the ideas that Keegan has been talking about and many of us have been following for a long time, and try and share with you a little bit about what we've learned about how to make leadership development developmental. And the phrase comes essentially from his Immunity to Change book with Lisa Leahy, where basically he claims that most of what is called leadership development is really skill development or behavioral change. But to create developmental development requires a different approach. And for those of you who were at his Immunity to Change workshop, you recognize you go along through this process and all of a sudden you get to this place where he says, okay, now our natural tendency is to do X, to try and fix these things. But what really we know from our own experience that if it was so simple to change those behaviors, we would have done it already. And so he said, so what that kind of insight, that kind of recognition brought him and Lisa and his colleagues was the awareness that you need to step back and try and see what's going on under the surface. What is kind of holding these things in place? And that leads to the latter parts of this Immunity to Change process and gives some insight into how to take a perspective on what's going on for us. Now I should ask, is my voice okay to the back? Okay, good. Because we got two microphones here. I can have one in each hand, but we're good. Good. So, context. Always like some of that. Welcome. See? Come on in. Hope lunch was good. So I can say this because yesterday we snuck in late to a presentation, so that's why we're just getting started gradually here. So the first context is, as I say, I have a PhD student Camilla Fixa, who presented with me last year in Prague, and about 3 years ago, we started designing a new course in our Masters in Organizational Leadership program. and with the explicit intent to see how could we try and foster developmental leadership development within the constraints of a 5-day course spread out over about 3 months with mid-level managers coming in from all over Norway, from all kinds of government, industry, healthcare, education, nonprofit. And so within that context, we said, how can we try and make a course that actually gives these leaders some kind of seed that they can use going forward in a way that will help stimulate their development. And we'll talk about what that means more. Maybe now that the room is more full, I'll do another show of hands. How many of you were at Keegan's workshop? All right, we got a few. Okay, how many of you know of Robert Keegan's work? And it's more. And how many of you are just curious as hell to hear what this means? Okay, so we got a rate. We'll try and cover the spectrum here. Okay, yeah, said that. All right. So one of the interesting challenges was that the website promoting, this is in the continuing education department, I have to translate everything to Norwegian, of course. And one of the things that I've learned is, of course, Norwegian is a relatively simple language compared to the richness of English. And so I said, well, here's the course title, Leadership Development and Organizational Transformation. We're going to do it all in 5 days. So unfortunately, there's no word for transformation in Norwegian. The best they could come up with was change. And so we work with that. This is one of the challenges in doing this work we've recognized, is that we often have to kind of deconstruct some of the language and principles. So for instance, in the 4-column work, the first column, commitment. You ask people to come, what is something you're really committed to getting better? Well, they're looking at me, what do you mean? Commitment doesn't have a translation in Norwegian. So there's a number of challenges that we've encountered in trying to do this, which in one way has been very helpful because it helps slow us down and take stock and really bridge to where the people are at, where the language and the consciousness of the culture is. Okay, so I want to look at some core distinctions in leadership education. And really, for me, for many years, I did my PhD at Gonzaga. How many of you are familiar with Gonzaga's program? Yes? You might be, yes. And while I was there, I was also kind of pursuing some research in the area of consciousness studies. And one of the things I started to come across was this notion of integral approaches to different studies. And one of the primary distinctions there was between kind of internal and external approaches. And so in terms of external things, there are lots of relevant behaviors, skills, and knowledge about organizational structures that are really important for learning leadership. And there are lots of MBA programs, MOL programs, and so on that do a good job of teaching those things. What I started to see was that how people use those things, how they kind of apply the skills, that has much more to do with the internal part. And so for me, this notion of leadership development is about developing the internal operating system or the structures of consciousness. So for those of you familiar with Keegan's work, this notion of structures of consciousness will be clear, and a little later on I'll give a little kind of overview and description of it in a simple way to give those of you who aren't as familiar some bearings. Come on in. We still got seats. You got to come up more to the front maybe though. So what happens, you come late, you got to sit up front. You want to shuffle over one?
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. No, I came in late yesterday after lunch, so I know how it is. So, thinking of this distinction around internal and external, we started to look at what kind of distinctions do we want to make in terms of these structures of consciousness. So, how many of you have kids who are under 5 years old? Okay. They live in a world that is magical and mythical, right? Cartoons are real, those kind of things. Have you tried to teach them arithmetic? No. We generally wait till kids are 6, 7 or so. So what I say is, a 4-year-old you can't teach arithmetic to, because the structure of their consciousness, the operating system of how they make meaning and organize experience, is such that it doesn't make sense to try and teach arithmetic. So Jean Piaget's work was basically, fundamental in helping people understand these distinctions. So an 8-year-old you can teach arithmetic to, because they can do what Piaget calls concrete operations. They can think in a logical, linear way. But you don't teach an 8-year-old algebra. You wait till they're about 12 or so. And by that time, you start to get access to what Piaget calls formal operational thinking, or abstract thinking. So you can start to take concrete numbers and put X or Y or Z in as an abstract representation and have it make sense to them. Now what Keegan has talked about for a long time, and a number of other people have in a number of ways, is that we've had this image in our society that when our bodies stop maturing, that our minds are kind of set. Our brain stops maturing, and we're all adults now, and we all kind of think basically alike. And what Keegan and others have shown is that the reality is our minds can evolve in adulthood. And even our brains. So there was a neuro leadership conference going on earlier this week in Boston as well. And the whole field of neuroplasticity is starting to say also that it's not just our minds and our structures of how we think that can evolve, but our brains can still evolve in adulthood as well. It may not be common, it may not be well supported in our society, but it is possible. So, in Keegan's understanding, what he's talking about is how, when you go from the kind of teenage, egocentric world into adulthood, you come into what he describes as the socialized mind. And what he means by that is that we gain clues about how to behave in the world from outside of ourselves. We look to experts who are teachers, church leaders, parents, role models, and they all give us ideas about how to fit into the world as a responsible citizen and adult. And that's all really necessary and really helpful and really useful. The challenge that Keegan points out is that there's more steps beyond that. And that at some point, we reach the limitations of being able to make meaning in this way because we get confronted with situations that are asking something more of us. And so he talks about the self-authoring or creative mind as a way of saying that at some stage we learn how to differentiate from all of these external influences that kind of make us up and start to choose among them and maybe put things together and pull part of it out and put a different part in, and we self-author, or we start to create an identity for ourselves. And a very simple way of looking at that in relation to leadership is to say that if we're always reacting to the environment, that's not really leading. Leading implies that we innovate, we create something new, we go forward. And it's very hard to do if we're always looking outside of ourselves to figure out how should we behave. Now, it's a bigger room than I expected, so we're not going to be able to break into circles and such, but at this point I get tired of hearing my own voice for a while, and I want to see if people have comments or questions about this, because this is kind of a core part of what we're going to talk about the research that we're doing and so on. So we should stop and just get any comments or feedback, questions. Oh, everybody just went in there. You're sure now? I'm good at this. I outweigh my students all the time. No? So far everybody's with me. Okay. So one of the things that we looked at in thinking about how to create a course that can enable this kind of development is this notion of creative tension. So how many of you are familiar with Peter Singer's work, The Fifth Discipline? Right? Most of you, okay. So in there, one of these things is recognizing that there is a gap often between our ideals and the espoused theories and the actual theories in use that we practice. And the creative tension of that gap can motivate us for change. What often happens, though, is that the degree of our awareness of that gap is really lacking. And of course, that's, especially in the academic world, we live in our heads lots. We live in our espoused values. So what we think, and there's a lot of literature that talks about this, that transformation, and what Keegan says, comes from a balance of challenge and support. And so often people go through crises, midlife crisis, you lose a job, or you get promoted. This can be a crisis. And it is in these moments that people become more reflective and that this gap becomes easier to have awareness of. So what we looked at in this course is, can we create a crucible for facilitating transformative experiences in a leadership and development course? We got 5 days with these people. Can we get them to open themselves up and reflect on themselves in a way that will enable us to kind of plant some kind of germ or seed that can transform over time? Because what we know is that at the end of the 5 days, we just get them started and send them out into the world. There are other courses they're taking, but the whole program isn't necessarily oriented around, I didn't get to design the whole thing, so we only get to go so far with it. We'll work on that later in other programs. So we did 2 things, essentially, in this course to facilitate this. And the first is we try to illuminate this gap, make them painfully aware of it. And believe me, there is pain. So some of you may be familiar with the Leadership Circle 360 instrument. Any of you? Or yeah? A few? Okay. So Bob Anderson, the creator of this, tells this story that he worked with Peter Block for a long time and did workshops and so on. Welcome. Come on in. There's a couple seats way up front here. We can't do that with the church. Yeah. So Bob Anderson had done these workshops and consulting work and so on with people like Block and Singe and so on for a long time. And then he was reading Keegan's In Over Our Heads book. And one of the chapters on there in this book, which looks at basically the implicit curriculum of modern life in different domains in relation to these structures of consciousness. And the basic gist of the book is that there's an implicit demand in all of the literature to be self-authoring, and that 2/3 of the population is not. And so Keegan said people then experience being asked to do things that have an implicit message in them that they don't understand. So anyway, Bob Anderson is reading the chapter on leadership that Keegan writes. And Keegan says, now we're talking about leadership literature. So for example, let's look at Peter Block. I've got Bob's attention. And he showed how very clearly Peter Block is implicitly asking leaders as an empowered manager or doing flawless consulting or having a stewardship orientation. It requires a certain structure of consciousness to just naturally be that way, to get it. The same, I teach in a Master's in Counseling program, and one of the things we use is this film done in the 60s, I think, where Fritz Perls, Carl Rogers, and Albert Ellis all work with Gloria. And Keegan does the same thing in this book with them, and he deconstructs how each of them is implicitly asking her to make meaning in this self-authoring structure of consciousness. So this is a very pervasive, almost invisible thing going on in our society. And I can see it myself in the leadership literature. I did a master's in organizational leadership and then a PhD. And as I reflect on that literature, it says, yeah, what a good leader is these things. And how do we, so you try to train them through teaching them the symptoms of that, the behaviors, the skills, which for the people who kind of get it and naturally do it, those are just, that's just the external side of it. But for those people who don't get it, that's the only way they have to look at it. So they're not able to kind of get it from the inside. So they fake it till they make it, if they can. So what this 360 does, and this is what we do the first day of the course, we orient people towards the course, we give them an idea of development, and we show them this and say, what we're going to ask you to do now is go and get about 8 to 15 people that you work with. Your boss, maybe your boss's boss, your peers, subordinates, and maybe others. Maybe your wife or husband, maybe other friends, and there's categories for each of these in this. And we want you to ask them to fill out this online survey about you, and you'll fill it out about yourself. And then a month later, they come back, and we have these reports for them that look something like this. There's a lot of data tables as well, but essentially, they get a graphic that looks like this. And I'm not going to go into great detail about it, but this single line here in different places represents the person's score of themselves, and all the filled-in part represents how others experience them. And you can imagine very quickly when you look at, say, this, there's a gap there. People kind of start looking at that and thinking, I thought I had a lot of integrity in this particular dimension. Turns out other people aren't seeing that. What's going on here? This can create the kind of crisis that we were looking for. It gets people motivated to say, okay, my leadership isn't everything I thought it was. Or sometimes it's the opposite. My God, I thought I was terrible, and these other people experienced me really good. Why don't I have the self-confidence? What's going on? Within this 360 instrument, there's a line down the middle here. All of the dimensions up here are basically, will correlate positively with effective leadership and are implicitly self-authoring consciousness constructs. All of the things here where it says a reactive, as where this is creative, these are more personality styles. Based on Karen Horney's work, for instance, says that there's 3 fundamental ways we tend to relate to the world. We're either trying to feel safe by having control over the world, or by pleasing the world, or by kind of stepping back and being distant from it and protecting ourselves. And so those show up in different ways, and these tend to be more of these reactive structures of consciousness. Now, we all have them in us. It's the degree to which they are running the show that can limit the effectiveness of our leadership. So that's the first thing that we do. Give them this. They come back into the course, like I say, a month later. We give a bit more orientation, some examples, prepare them, and then they get these. And then we have some coaches in the room, and we have some other rooms. We take them out one at a time, and they each get about 45 minutes or an hour with a one-on-one coaching session to debrief their profile, help them understand what's going on. And I kind of work with them as a group in the room and float around. They've got some worksheets. And what they're looking to do then is kind of identify, well, there's a lot of different things I see here that I could work on. but what's the one thing that if I had to say, sticks with me the most, and judging from the feedback of the people around me, would actually make a big difference to them. Now, for those of you who were in Keegan's workshop yesterday, you know that he has his own way of doing this, which was quite effective. It's just imagine you're having a conversation with half a dozen other people, and what would they say, and pick one of these things. In the book, he says when he works with organizations and clients, he'll use some kind of survey to try and get some input in. He's actually just gotten trained in this, and is looking at using this as a survey instrument to feed into the immunity to change work. So I said, I happen to have been doing this for 2 years. He says, I want to hear about it. So it's what we have found so far is that it is very effective in creating that kind of crisis or crucible we're talking about, where people suddenly feel very self-aware, because suddenly they see how others see them in relation to how they see themselves, and there's inevitably challenges there. What is more challenging for us, and we're going to work on starting this winter when we do the course again, is learning how to get better at helping them focus on one thing out of this. Because what tends to happen now is they kind of it's hard for them to focus. There's a lot going on for them. And how to narrow that down and crystallize it into one thing to take into the community to change work is a bit of a challenge yet. So we're working on that. So the second part is then they come back a month later. We do 2 days in a row. And after the first day, they debrief their profile and get down to kind of, what's the one thing you want to focus on that we'll look at in the rest of the course. We then take them through this. Now, since there's a range of awareness of this, I'll kind of go through it, not in great detail, but enough so you have a sense of what's going on. For those of you who are curious to read the short version, I have about a 6-page overview of Keegan and Leahy's book that's available online for free. And I can give you, also the paper that this is based on is on my website as well, and I'll give you the URL for that at the end, that you can download all this kind of stuff. But what Keegan and Leahy have designed is this process whereby how development happens, which is essentially taking what we are subject to and making it an object of reflection, is something that is, how do you structure that? This is a way to structure that. So they start with this notion of commitments. What is something that we feel would make a really big difference to ourselves and those around us if we are able to get better at it? And so, as I say, we use the 360 to get them into that and get them to crystallize that in a way. I've done this with a variety of different groups, and what I've found is that if you can get people to really feel it in their body, that they when they're speaking what it is, that it resonates with them and it has a certain tone in their voice, you can tell it's kind of landed in a certain way. And that's what I found is that's quite important, because if people just have an idea up here in their heads, they can intellectually go through this and it will take them in certain ways. But the more you kind of invest in getting to a good starting place, the further this process can take people. So the second column here, then, once you've got a commitment here, what they ask is to make a list of behaviors of what you do and don't do that get in the way of you realizing that commitment. So Bob gave an example yesterday of dieting. Lots of people have a commitment to lose weight and diet. Since he had that. And then he'd had trouble because it had gone up and down over many years, and he says his colleague, Leahy, challenged him to apply this process to himself. So one of the things he said was, what do I do or not do? Well, I don't eat good portions. I eat what I feel like. I want it all. I don't. So he had a whole list of behaviors, of things he did and or didn't do that went against this commitment. And what's really important here is that these are behaviors, actions, not just kind of general abstract things, but they need to be very concrete. So everybody can go here fairly quickly. And it's kind of like, what they say, it's kind of like Alcoholics Anonymous. You make a full moral confession of all your sins, so to speak. And then what inevitably happens, I write about this in the little kind of article where I talk about an application I did of this for a senior management team in England. The tendency is so strong as we make this list to figure out how to fix those things. Just automatically we go there. And what Keegan says is, don't do that. Don't go there. Trying to fix these things is exactly the kind of cycle we've been in that perpetuates. And so he called them like New Year's resolutions. And we know how well those generally go. So the next step in this process, where it starts to get a little difficult for people, and what I find is kind of like you've got to herd people's attention, is he says, what would happen? What would it feel like to you if you did the opposite of these behaviors you've listed here? And he's really clear. He says, that doesn't mean, it would feel really good because then I'd be making my commitment. The reality is, if we really kind of got into it and role-played and imagined it, we can feel in our body that there's certain worries or fears that come up. And so we start to learn, he asks us to write down, what are those fears? What are those worries? And from there, he does this slick little thing, I call it like an Aikido move, where in Aikido you take your opponent has some energy they're attacking, and rather than trying to meet it like that, you take it and just kind of divert it. So you take this energy people have around this fear or worry about doing the opposite of what they generally do, and ask them to make a simple grammatical change in the sentence. And rather than say, I fear or I worry, to say, I am committed to not having whatever it is happen. So when I was going through it yesterday, I had an issue about, I'm committed to not being so controlling. My wife would really like this. And so I could list a whole lot of things that I do and don't do around this. And then I realized, I'm worried that it will, for instance, restrict my freedom. If I'm not in control of the situation, my freedom might get restricted. And then what I could do is say, well, I'm committed to not having my freedom restricted. It's like a double negative. And what he says is, it's important because you need the fear to be there in the commitment. And what happens when you make a list of competing commitments is you start to understand why these behaviors you're doing or not doing make total sense. And then you start to see, as he says in his book, while you have one foot on the gas pedal here, trying to make change, and you have one foot on the brake over here, holding things in place. So, and then as he said very eloquently yesterday, basically if that was the end of the exercise, what you learn is you're screwed. No change is going to happen. And if we left people there, that would really suck. So the fourth column is this notion of saying, okay, well, what do we assume to be true that creates these competing commitments? What is it about the world that, we feel? And it may be that it's not one or the other. It may be that half of it is true and half of it isn't or whatever. But the idea is we get at these, and then from there, there's an exercise, and this is what we do with our students. We spend probably 4 or 5 hours it takes to work them through this. And it's fascinating because what you see is, as Keegan talks about, as you get towards these big assumptions, there's these little signs that go off in people's minds. Danger, danger, don't go here. And the way I see that show up was really exemplified. There was this one woman in the course who was a psychiatrist, a leader at the hospital, and she said, I can see what they're trying to do here. This is brilliant. But she could not write the sentence that says, I am committed to. It was like a fog was in front of her mind, and she couldn't do that until she had some help, and we, helped her through okay. But this resistance to seeing these assumptions is very strong in people. So it takes us a few hours to get there. And at the end of the second day of the second part of the course, what we do is help them design a test of this assumption. Now what's essential about this, and what's going to relate to this whole thing of making leadership development developmental, is that the test isn't to see if they can change their behavior. They may do something different as a test of their assumption, but the purpose of the activity is to gain information about the degree of truth or falseness of their assumption. And so in the course, they come back then a month later and report on what happened when they did these things, debrief, share, and then we go into various other things around language and culture and storytelling that talk about how they can use these things to transform organizations. So here's some brief quotes from some of the students. One of the things that we did then is Camilla, my doctoral student, is doing her doctoral research. She's gathering kind of different kinds of data from the students on what is facilitating their development. So here, it was an eye-opener. From being completely convinced of what I had experienced, the mind slowly was starting to tell me differently. And working through these assumptions and being able to release some of the energy these have kept stored inside of me, I think I'll get a long way. Another one, it became clear to me that I'm definitely trapped in the same human ways of perception. I'm better identifying what other people shouldn't do than I am in evaluating my own actions. We can all relate to these things. Very important thing to add, right? The troubles I experienced were my own, the experiences were my own. To remember them won't be a problem, but to remember not to project those onto other people can be difficult. So, there's a lot of this kind of self-reflection going on, but one of the things that we were curious about then is what is going on subjectively for these people in relation to how they understand development, how they understand leadership, in relation to other leaders as well. So how many of you are familiar with Q methodology as a research method? You are? A few? Okay. It's very interesting. I'm relatively new to it, but it was devised in the 30s. Q had to do with like quantum. So the prevailing methodology in science has been statistical, kind of empirical research methodologies. And in the last 30 years or so, qualitative methodologies have come to the foreground more. So Q method is actually a more empirical way of studying subjectivity. And so what you do basically is you take sentences or statements from literature, from common language that people use around a topic, and you have these kind of displayed out in front of people, and in this case I think there were 42 of them, and you ask them to sort them. You say which ones are the most like me and which are the least like me, and which are, I'm kind of indifferent to. And then you can do all sorts of nifty statistical manipulations around how people sort these. And in this case, Camilla got about 65 leaders to do this Q sort. And about 25 of them were students from our class. And they did this at the end of the 5-day class. So I found a number of so here's some examples from the statements, right? Emails, telephones, and immediate basic things usually take me away from my work, long-term work and good organizing, or The gap between espoused vision and action doesn't engage me much. I don't use that to reflect on. So these are just some samples of some of the statements. What we found was there were 4 clear factors that emerged. Really nice, clear ones, which was nice. Considering she's doing her whole PhD on this, it's good when you get good data. That they tended to represent 3 differing structures of consciousness, and one of them appeared to be kind of in transition between 2 of these structures. And that what it pointed to was a reflective capacity and learning as really important elements. So, I'm going to go through this fairly quick because I see where time is zipping by. There were some statements that everybody had in common. So we looked at these as kind of cultural norms that people felt, yeah, they're okay. I'm not going to go through these here. They're in the paper that you can download. The factor 1 had statements like coaching and mentoring is part of my leadership style. They really related that. They didn't relate to the idea that diversity is too idealistic and not part of it. They identified negatively with that statement. This factor had most of the students from our leadership class, and they displayed characteristics of the sensitive self, or green mean in spiral dynamics terms, or individualist in Torbert's terms, which is definitely kind of fourth order fully fourth order in Keegan's terms, and that they tended to use much more of a process coaching and mentoring style. They were more intuitive than rational. Now, one of the things that we know is a further question to ask, was this really helped by the course, or did these people who took the course kind of self-select in because they were naturally like that? Right? That's going to be something that is for further on. But at least we saw that most of the ones who took this sort from our class sorted in this factor. So that reflectiveness was good. Factor 2, more statements, lots more. So this one, they were educated as either civil engineers or economists. One of the other ones, lots of them had a more educational background, and they are more achiever, or in Joyner and Joseph's terms, or orange in spiral dynamics. And here they believe that leaders are more born and not made. The third one, this is the one that appeared to be in transition between factor 4 and 2, kind of blue-orange in spiral dynamics terms. They least agreed that reflections on challenging situations helped them be the leader they are today. So this is one of the things that was puzzling for Camilla for a while, sorting this out, is what is this factor? Until she realized that there were certain things that were indicative of them being in transition because things were unstable for them in certain ways. And they had a lot of feelings of uncertainty and low self-esteem which related to this transition. They didn't kind of know who they were and where they stood. Their world was breaking apart and reforming, and they were in that process, so they were uncertain. In factor 4, these people appeared very rational, more like blue in spiral dynamics, or more expert level in Torbert or Joyner and Joseph's model. Much more of this third order structure of consciousness, or the socialized mind in Keegan. They like structure and don't look at change as bringing new possibilities. So that's kind of the basic preliminary results, which suggest that there were different structures of consciousness at work in these 4 different factors that came out of the study. And that factor 1 showed the highest degree of reflective capacity. And one of the things that we learn in developmental theory is that what cognitive development is about essentially is in enabling us to make greater and greater subtleties of differentiation and distinctions over a broader and more complex scope of area. And so that ability to reflect is kind of a key component. And of course for leadership, that's, lots of the literature is saying this. As a leader, you need to be able to take a step back, get a bigger picture, see a bigger picture, and translate that in a meaningful way for the people that you're leading. And so, as I said earlier, there's a possibility that our program contributed to this. There's a possibility that people self-selected in. and this is for future work to look at. So, our conclusions, yes. We've seen through this that it has been possible to create a crucible for transformation. We can kind of put leaders in it's not an artificial situation because we're using 360 feedback from their colleagues and peers in their life work. So it's bringing their work world kind of into the classroom live for them. And that does create this crucible where they feel the pressure of that environment motivating them to do something. And Keegan talks a lot about a consciousness bridge. How do we help leaders go from where they're at to where they'd like to be? From their theories in use to their espoused values, their ideals. And that's a challenge. And it's often uncharted territory because it is all this kind of soft, fuzzy internal stuff that is hard to kind of pin down in a certain way. And the question is, is this process actually developmental for leaders and does it stick? Well, I've got another master's thesis student who's going to actually follow up with some of these people and interview them a year, 2 years later and see, has this stuck with them in certain ways? So there's lots of work yet to do. I bet it's time for questions. I really talked more than one of us now. And I have handouts that have nothing to do with my presentation. But they're nice pieces of art. Something else I do is I edit a journal called Integral Review, and so this is our little calling card. So I've got to give you something. And if they run out before we get there, we got more. So what do we got for time here? We got 12 minutes. We got at least a little bit of questions and discussion. Yes? Good question. So the general procedure for doing a Q-sort like this is you look at literature, you can look at emails, conversation, you try and look at the discourse in the field and pick out statements. And so then out of a large array of statements, we went through and tried to sort, okay, which ones are repetitive, which ones are reflective of these different kinds of range of discourse that we see. And so there's a whole process for generating that. Dennis, you had
two things I'm wondering about. First is, do you or your colleagues use the subject-object interview at all?
No, none of us are trained in that.
Okay.
Would like to.
Are you suggesting that you're intentionally trying to develop a change in consciousness, to use Keegan's term, not so much in the meaning of change, but in over our heads, that you're trying to, again, move people from a 3 to a 4, perhaps? And wouldn't it, my last thing, and I'll be quiet, is, well, I understand that you're dealing with a course. Would you talk about implications for this for a program?
Right. So one thing to be clear is that we're not thinking that we can facilitate a stage of development in a course. That's for sure. What we are aiming to do is to give them experience with a mechanism, the 4-column thing, that they can internalize and start to apply to a wide range of experiences in their life. And that process of going through, taking something that's going on and being able to make an object of reflection of it, facilitates development over time.
So to use like Mesmer's, it's a disorienting dilemma.
Right.
The crucible you talk about is to say, man, okay, take a look at the difference with the gap there.
And here's a structure to do that with. And by training them in that structure. So there's two things going on. One is they get something concrete out of the very thing they put in the exercise. But the larger underlying process is that we're trying to give them a tool they can use as they go out into the world. The implications for the program, I think probably the best person to talk to about something like that is Terry O'Fallon. Her work at Pacific Integral. They are measuring this kind of change over a 2-year program that's very intentionally designed to facilitate this. So it is possible. People are doing it. but it's a lot of work. Yeah?
Um, you mentioned the 4 factors.
Yes.
So nobody in that class showed up as going beyond individualist, or is it just...
No.
You
No.
didn't have any strategies?
I mean, we weren't assessing development. We were interpreting the factors and looking at the characteristics. What kind of consciousness do they appear to represent? So it's not a rigorous analysis because she just got the data like a month ago, sorted. And just looking at that, say what kind of patterns can we see? And it looks like this and this and this. And so in her doctoral thesis, she'll go into that much more thoroughly.
And the reliability as compared to the leadership development profile, for instance,
of the Q methodology part, of the Q methodology, I'm not so well versed to understand, but I know that the statistical manipulations that go on are quite solid and rigorous. So when you get clear factors, you've got clear factors. That's the comments from the people that know me. Now what about those of you who come from afar and are maybe curious?
How does the leadership circle assessment work? Is it online? Is there a price per observer? Or how does that?
Yeah, I can talk with you more about that afterwards if you want, but just briefly, it's an online instrument. There's about 120 questions. Each of the 28 or so dimensions on there has between 2 and 5 questions. The statistical reliability of that is that there are 2 of the 28, in fact, somebody did an independent study, 2 of the 28 have an alpha of 0.64, and all the rest are 0.78 or 9. So it's very internally reliable. It also was interesting that Jack Zenger did a meta-study of 360s and feedback and looked at what are the dimensions of effective leadership and came up with like 16 that are almost identical to the ones that are in the leadership circle. So it's kind of parallel tracks finding the same kind of dimensions.
When you say there's 120 questions, though, there is survey fatigue, and they've shown that maximum should be about 20 questions, and after that 20th question, we tend to lose the focus of the person marking and giving interpretation because they're either rushing through it or I'm just curious how that...
Could be. I don't know. This generally takes people about 20 to 25 minutes to do. It's just kind of point and click with your mouse. So that's a good question. I mean, we haven't had... I can't say I've seen issues with that because it doesn't take so long. But that's... Yeah, I'd be curious to look into that. Yeah.
I was wondering about street space, or doing some based approach, which
The
do you take a street space approach to developing these leaders, or do you take a different based approach, really? That is example of...
Right. That's a very good question. So I'll repeat it a little bit. Do we take a strength-based approach or a deficit-based approach? And we're very clear when we debrief their profile, there's all sorts of opportunities there. The first thing we do is, what are their strengths? What can they build on? And then, what are the areas they may want to improve in, and how can those be used, the strengths be used to do that? So it's not a full-on appreciative inquiry, we're only going to look at what's working kind of thing, but it's not just saying, let's just zero in on the problems. And so we do recognize that there is some value to look at the shadows or the gaps or whatever, but we do it in the context of saying, okay, you've got these things to work with. And from there, how can you bring things up?
Yeah, if I can add something in the leadership circle, whatever you have at the bottom, you know exactly where you improve on that every time.
Yeah.
So the bottom correlates with another aspect.
Yeah, I didn't go into it in such detail, but what she brings up is, for instance, if you're very controlling, you're actually trying to get things done, and there's a dimension in the top half that's related to that. So it's a lot about how are you trying to achieve your values, and helping leaders kind of upgrade their operating system so that the how that they go about things with is more effective. quiet bunch. You ready? We can get out early?
What was the name of the meta-analysis that you mentioned?
Oh, Jack Zenger.
And you're going to get the big one.
Oh, yeah, so if you want, here we go, I don't have it up on the screen. If you want to download this article I wrote on immunity to change or the paper that goes with this presentation, go to jonathanreams.com. Really easy. Just spell it out on my name tag here. There's no H in the first part, just JONATHANREAMS.com. And there's over on the right, there's writings and downloads. If you look through, you'll see one that says immunity to change, report from the field, and one that says International Leadership Association 2010 paper. And so they're there as PDFs to download or links to go to the journal. So thank you all for coming.